The F-16 Fighting Falcon screamed across the desert floor at 300 feet, its afterburner painting orange fire against the Pride-on darkness. Inside the cockpit, Captain Maya Phoenix Rodriguez felt her heart hammering against her ribcage. As she pulled the stick back, climbing into the purple sky where stars still fought against the coming dawn, her hands trembled not from fear, but from the electric knowledge that everything she'd trained for, everything she'd sacrificed for, was about to be stripped away. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The radio crackled with static, then cleared to reveal Colonel Marcus Blackwood's voice, sharp as broken glass. "Phoenix, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Your flying privileges are hereby suspended, pending a full investigation into your conduct during yesterday's training exercise." Maya's jaw clenched. Yesterday, the low-level pass that had sent 3 ground crews diving for cover. The maneuver. That had been perfect, textbook even, except for the fact that it had violated the sacred 20-foot minimum altitude by exactly 6 inches according to the base's radar systems. 6 inches that meant the difference between being celebrated as a tactical genius and being branded as reckless. "Copy that, Control," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. "Phoenix returning to base." But as she banked left toward Nellis Air Force Base, her eyes caught something that made her blood freeze. Far below, moving across the desert like deadly insects, a convoy of unmarked vehicles was threading through the canyon passes. 12 vehicles moving in perfect formation, their black paint absorbing the morning light. She'd seen convoys before supply runs, training exercises, diplomatic escorts. This was different. These vehicles moved with the predatory precision of hunters, and they were heading directly toward the small border town of Esperanza. Maya had grown up in Esperanza. Population 847, give or take whoever had left for the cities or whoever had returned home to die. Her grandmother still lived there, in the small adobe house where Maya had learned to fix engines and dream of flying. Every weekend leave, Maya would drive the 43 miles to sit on the porch with Abuela Carmen, drinking café con leche and listening to stories about the old days when the town had been prosperous, when the mine had still been operational, when young people stayed instead of fleeing to Las Vegas or Phoenix. The convoy disappeared behind a ridge, but Maya's combat-trained mind had already calculated their trajectory. 37 minutes to Esperanza at their current speed. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't a social visit. Her radio buzzed again. "Phoenix, your ETA is now overdue. Colonel Blackwood is requesting your immediate presence in his office." Colonel Marcus Blackwood, West Point graduate, Desert Storm veteran, and the kind of officer who believed that discipline was more important than innovation. He'd made it clear from Maya's first day at Nellis that he considered her a liability, too aggressive, too willing to push boundaries, too Mexican for his carefully ordered world. The fact that she was one of the best pilots to ever graduate from the academy meant nothing to him. Rules were rules, and Maya Rodriguez had broken them. "Control, I need to report possible hostile movement in Grid 77 Alpha," Maya said, her voice tight with urgency. 12 vehicles, unmarked, heading toward civilian population center. The pause on the radio lasted too long. When Control responded, it wasn't with concern, but with irritation. "Phoenix, you are to cease all reconnaissance activities and return to base immediately. Any further delays will result in additional disciplinary action." Maya stared at the radio, disbelief washing over her like cold water. They weren't going to investigate. They weren't going to send backup. They were going to let whatever was about to happen in Esperanza happen, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the pilot they were about to ground might actually know what she was talking about. She thought of her grandmother, probably already up, feeding the chickens behind the house and listening to the morning News on the ancient radio that had belonged to Maya's grandfather. She thought of Miguel Santos, who ran the only grocery store in town and always asked about Maya's flying when she visited. She thought of the children who played in the dusty streets, the teenagers who gathered at the old gas station to talk about escaping to the big city, the elderly men who sat in the shade of the church and played dominoes, while their wives gossiped about whose daughter had married whom. 847 people who had no idea that death was driving toward them through the desert. Morning. Maya single quotes as decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear as the desert air around her. She could return to base, face Blackwood's disciplinary hearing, accept whatever punishment they deemed fit for her 6-inch transgression. She could watch her career end with a whimper, another promising pilot crushed under the weight of military bureaucracy. Or she could do what she'd sworn to do, when she'd raised her right hand and pledged to support and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Control, Phoenix experiencing radio malfunction. She lied, reaching over to switch her transponder to emergency frequency, attempting to resolve technical difficulties. She turned off her radio before Control could respond, diving back toward the desert floor where the convoy had disappeared. The silence in her cockpit was absolute now, broken only by the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the whisper of electronics. For the first time in 3 years of military flying, she was completely alone with her aircraft and her conscience. F-16 responded to her touch like a living thing, dropping toward the rocky terrain with predatory grace. Maya had always felt most at home in the cockpit, surrounded by instruments that made sense, dealing with physics that obeyed consistent laws. On the ground, she was Maya Rodriguez from Esperanza, the mechanic's daughter who'd somehow talked her way into the Air Force Academy despite her accent, and her background and the skeptical looks from instructors who'd never seen someone like her succeed. In the air, she was simply Phoenix, deadly, precise, and absolutely in control. The convoy had vanished into a maze of canyons that Maya knew like the lines on her own palms. She'd explored every inch of this desert as a child, following her father on hunting trips and camping expeditions. The landscape looked desolate to outsiders, but Maya could read it like a book. Every ridge had a story. Every arroyo had been carved by flash floods that came without warning, and every hidden valley had sheltered someone or something at some point in its long history. She found them again 15 minutes later, moving along a dirt road that didn't appear on any official maps, but had been used by smugglers and coyotes for decades. The vehicles had spread out now, no longer maintaining military formation. They were trying to look casual, like a group of ranchers or mining surveyors heading out for a normal day's work. But Maya could see the weapons mounted on several of the vehicles, the way the passengers scanned the horizons with trained eyes, the disciplined spacing that spoke of professional soldiers rather than civilian workers. Her fuel gauge showed 43 minutes of flying time remaining. Enough to get back to base with a comfortable reserve, or enough to shadow the convoy until they reached Esperanza. The choice should have been simple. She was already in enough trouble without adding unauthorized reconnaissance to her list of infractions. But as she watched the vehicles navigate the desert terrain with practiced efficiency, Maya felt something cold and certain settling in her stomach. These weren't smugglers or treasure hunters, or any other type of civilian criminals. These were professionals, and they were heading toward a town full of people who had no way to defend themselves against whatever was coming. Maya pulled back on the stick, climbing to a higher altitude where her aircraft's distinctive silhouette would be less noticeable against the brightening sky. She'd shadow them until they revealed their intentions, then figure out her next move. If they turned away from Esperanza, she could report their position and head back to face whatever punishment awaited her. If they continued toward the town... She tried not to think about what she might have to do if they continued toward the town. The radio in her helmet crackled with intercepted transmissions as the convoy communicated with each other in clipped, professional tones. Maya's Spanish was fluent. It had been her first language, but these voices carried accents she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, maybe, or possibly Middle Eastern. Mercenaries then, rather than cartel soldiers or domestic terrorists. Falcon. 1 to all units, ETA to target is 22 minutes. Remember, we need the operation to look random. No witnesses, no survivors, no evidence that this was anything other than drug violence spilling over from across the border. Maya's hands tightened on the controls until her knuckles went white. They weren't just planning to attack Esperanza, they were planning to massacre everyone in it and make it look like cartel activity. 847 people, including her grandmother, were about to be murdered so that someone could cover their tracks or send a message or settle. A score that had nothing to do with the sleepy desert town that had never hurt anyone. The fuel gauge now showed 38 minutes. Enough time to get back to base if she left immediately. She keyed her radio back on, emergency frequency still active. Mayday, mayday. This is Captain Maya Rodriguez, callsign Phoenix, requesting immediate support for imminent attack on civilian population center Esperanza. Hostile convoy of 12 vehicles approaching from the north. ETA 18 minutes. Request immediate backup and authorization to engage. The radio remained silent for long seconds before a different voice responded. Not control, but someone. Higher up the chain. Captain Rodriguez, you are ordered to cease all unauthorized activities and return to base immediately. You are not authorized to engage any targets, and you are to discontinue all surveillance activities immediately. Sir, you don't understand, Maya said, desperation creeping into her voice. This is a massacre in progress. Civilians are about to die. Captain Rodriguez, the voice cut her off, cold and final. You are already facing disciplinary action for unsafe flying and insubordination. Any further unauthorized actions will result in court-martial proceedings and possible criminal charges. Return to base immediately. That is a direct order. Maya stared at the radio in disbelief. They knew. Someone up the chain of command knew exactly what was about to happen in Esperanza, and they were ordering her not to interfere. The convoy, the timing, the convenient lack of backup, none of this was coincidental. Her fuel gauge showed 35 minutes. Below her, the convoy had reached the final ridge before Esperanza. In 17 minutes, they would arrive in the town square where her grandmother bought vegetables every Tuesday morning. In 17 minutes, the killing would begin. Maya thought about her oath of commission, the words she'd spoken with her hand on a Bible in front of her family and friends. I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She thought about the Air Force Corps, values that had been drilled into her since her first day at the academy. Integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. Integrity first. Control, she said into her radio, her voice steady and calm despite the fire building in her chest. Phoenix declaring emergency authority under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I am engaging hostiles threatening civilian population center. She didn't wait for a response before switching off her radio again and diving toward the convoy. Maya had not always dreamed of flying fighter jets. As a child growing up in Esperanza, her dreams had been smaller, more practical. She'd wanted to fix cars like her father, maybe open her own garage in Las Vegas or Phoenix where there were enough people to keep a business running. Flying had been something that happened to other people, rich people, connected people, people who didn't speak Spanish at the dinner table or have to work summers in the copper mine to help pay for school supplies. The change had come on her 14th birthday, when a pair of F-16s had passed over the town during a routine training exercise. Maya had been in the backyard, helping her grandmother hang laundry on the line that stretched between two ancient mesquite trees, when the sound hit them, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself before revealing its source. in the silver shapes that flashed across the desert sky. "Mira mia," Abuela Carmen had said, pausing with a wet sheet in her hands. "Los Angeles del Cielo. Angels of the sky." Maya had watched those aircraft disappear into the distance, their contrails writing temporary poetry against the blue, and something had shifted inside her chest. Not just wonder, she'd felt wonder before, watching sunsets paint the mountains purple or seeing shooting stars during camping trips with her father. This was different. This was recognition, as if some part of her that had been sleeping had suddenly opened its eyes. That night, she'd gone to the town's small library and checked out every book they had about aviation. There weren't many. Esperanza wasn't the kind of place that attracted aerospace engineers or former pilots, but she'd devoured them all. She'd learned about lift and thrust, about the difference between subsonic and supersonic flight, about the men and women who'd pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. She'd also learned that people like her poor, brown speaking English as a second language didn't typically become fighter pilots. The realization should have been discouraging. Instead, it had been clarifying. Maya had always been stubborn, a trait that her mother blamed on her father and her father blamed on her mother. If the odds were against her, then she would simply have to be better than the odds expected. She'd thrown herself into her studies with an intensity that worried her parents and impressed her teachers. Mathematics, physics, engineering subjects that had never particularly interested her before became pathways to the sky. She'd graduated valedictorian of Esperanza High School's class of 43 students, turned down full scholarships to Arizona State and Austin, and accepted an appointment to the Air Force Academy that she'd earned through a combination of academic excellence, athletic achievement, and what the admissions board had politely called unique life experiences. The academy had been brutal. Not just the academics, though those had pushed her harder than anything she'd experienced in Esperanza's understaffed schools. Not just the physical demands, though she'd discovered muscles she'd never known existed during those first months of training. The hardest part had been the constant, grinding awareness that she didn't belong. Her classmates were mostly white, mostly from middle-class suburbs, mostly the children of officers or defense contractors or politicians. They spoke English with neutral accents, knew which fork to use at formal dinners, and understood references to movies and books and cultural touchstones that Maya had never encountered. They'd been polite to her face. Overt discrimination was forbidden at the academy, but she'd heard the whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. Diversity admission. Affirmative action case. Token minority. Maya had responded the only way she knew how, by being undeniably excellent at everything she attempted. She'd graduated third in her class, earned her pilot wings on the first attempt, and been selected for fighter training despite subtle pressure from some instructors to consider transport or tanker aircraft instead. More opportunities for advancement, they'd said. Better work-life balance. What they'd meant was, know your place. But Maya had made it to fighter training, and then to F-16 qualification, and finally to Nellis Air Force Base, where she'd proven herself among the best tactical pilots in the Air Force. She'd thought that success would finally silence the doubts, both others and her own. Instead, it had only made them louder. Because no matter how well she flew, no matter how precisely she hit her targets or how flawlessly she executed complex maneuvers, there was always someone ready to explain why her achievements were somehow less legitimate than those of her peers. She was naturally aggressive rather than tactically skilled. She was lucky rather than prepared. She took unnecessary risks rather than making calculated decisions under pressure. The truth was that Maya flew differently than most of her colleagues. Where they were methodical and predictable, she was intuitive and adaptive. Where they followed established procedures, she found creative solutions to complex problems. Where they maintained safe distances and comfortable margins, she pushed boundaries and explored possibilities. Yesterday's training exercise had been a perfect example. The scenario had called for a precision strike on a simulated enemy position, hidden in a narrow canyon. Standard procedure would have been to approach from high altitude, release ordnance from a safe distance, and aggress immediately. Maya had instead dropped to 60 feet above the desert, floor 54 feet according to the base's radar systems, and threaded her F-16 through the canyon at nearly the speed of sound, delivering her simulated payload with surgical precision. Before climbing out in a victory roll that had left the exercise observers simultaneously impressed and appalled, the mission had been a complete success. The target had been destroyed, no simulated casualties had been taken, and the time from initial approach to successful egress had been 43 seconds faster than the previous record. Maya had executed a maneuver that would have been remembered as brilliant if it had been performed by anyone else. Instead, she was being grounded for unsafe flying practices and failure to follow established procedures. Colonel Blackwood had made his feelings clear during the post-flight debrief. Maya could still hear his voice, cold and dismissive. "Captain Rodriguez, your disregard for safety protocols is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that gets pilots killed. You may think you're impressing people with these hot dog maneuvers, but all you're demonstrating is poor judgment and inadequate discipline." Maya had tried to explain her tactical reasoning, the split-second calculations that had made her approach not reckless but optimal, given the terrain and defensive positions. Blackwood had cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear excuses, Captain. I want to hear acknowledgement that you understand why your behavior was inappropriate and assurance that it won't happen again." She'd given him neither. Instead, she'd stood at attention and accepted her punishment in silence, knowing that any attempt to defend herself would only make things worse. Blackwood had already decided who she was and what she represented. Facts were irrelevant to that. Judgment. Now, diving toward the convoy that was 17 minutes away from massacring everyone she'd ever loved, Maya finally understood why she'd become a pilot. It wasn't about the aircraft or the adrenaline or the opportunity to serve her country. It was about moments like this one, when the choice between right and wrong was clear and uncomplicated by politics, or procedure or other people's expectations. She'd spent her entire career trying to prove that she belonged, that she deserved to be taken seriously, that she could follow rules and fit in and be the kind of pilot that men like Blackwood respected. But belonging had never been the point. The point was being ready when 847 people needed someone willing to do what others wouldn't or couldn't. Her aircraft's targeting system had acquired the lead vehicle. 12 hostiles moving in formation along a dirt road that would take them directly into Esperanza's main square. Maya's F-16 carried a full combat load, 2 AIM-12 OMRIME missiles for air-to-air engagements, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for ground targets, and 500 rounds of 20mm cannon, ammunition for close-range work. More than enough to stop a convoy. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent demands for her to return to base. Threats of court-martial and criminal prosecution, orders from officers whose names she recognized from briefings and ceremonies. Maya listened to them with the detached interest of someone watching a television show in a language she didn't understand. Their words had power only if she chose to acknowledge that power, and she was no longer choosing to do so. 15 minutes to Esperanza. Her fuel gauge showed 28 minutes of flying time remaining. Even if she engaged the convoy, she'd have enough fuel to return to base and face whatever consequences awaited her. The question was whether there would be anything left of her career, or her freedom after she did what needed to be done. Maya thought about her grandmother, who'd raised 5 children by herself after her husband had died in a mine accident, who'd worked 2 jobs to put Maya's mother through nursing school, who'd never complained about the sacrifices required to keep the family together. Abuela Carmen had always told Maya that courage wasn't the absence of fear, It was doing what needed to be done, despite the fear. "Mia," she'd said during Maya's last visit home, "you have a gift. Not just for flying, but for seeing what needs to be done. Don't let anyone convince you to make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger." Maya armed her weapon systems and dove toward the convoy. The first Maverick missile struck the lead vehicle at exactly 0847 hours local time, turning 12 tons of armored steel into an expanding ball of flame and shrapnel that painted the desert floor black for 30 yards in every direction. Maya had targeted the command vehicle specifically, hoping to disrupt their communications and create enough chaos to scatter the remaining 11 vehicles. Instead, the convoy responded with the disciplined efficiency of professional soldiers. Within seconds of the first explosion, the surviving vehicles had dispersed into defensive positions among the scattered boulders and dry arroyos that lined the desert road. Camouflaged gun positions that Maya hadn't noticed from altitude suddenly revealed themselves, sprouting anti-aircraft weapons that began tracking her F-16 with deadly precision. The convoy hadn't just been heading to Esperanza to conduct a massacre, they'd been prepared for air attack. "Son of a bitch," Maya breathed, throwing her aircraft into a hard left turn as tracer rounds painted orange lines through the air where she'd been flying. They were expecting this. The realization hit her like cold water. This wasn't a simple mercenary operation or even a sophisticated terrorist attack. This was a trap, carefully planned and perfectly executed, designed to draw her into exactly the position she now occupied. Someone had known that she would be in the air this morning, had known that she would spot the convoy, and had known that she would choose to engage despite orders to return to base. Someone had wanted her here. Maya's PUM radio crackled with a new voice, not Control or Colonel Blackwood, but someone she didn't recognize. The accent was American, educated, and absolutely calm despite the violence erupting in the desert below. "Captain Rodriguez," the voice said. "This is Deputy Director Thomas Garrison of the Defense Intelligence Agency. You have interfered with a classified operation of national security importance. Cease your attack immediately and return to base, or you will be designated as a hostile combatant and engaged accordingly." Defense Intelligence Agency. Maya felt her blood turn to ice. The DIA didn't get involved in routine military operations or border security missions. They handled the kind of classified operations that didn't officially exist, the kind of missions that required plausible deniability and expendable assets, the kind of missions that might require the destruction of a small border town and everyone in it. "Sir," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the anti-aircraft fire that was getting increasingly accurate. "I'm engaging hostiles threatening civilian population center Esperanza. Request immediate backup and clarification of operational parameters." The pause that followed lasted long enough for Maya to execute another evasive maneuver, diving low enough that her jet wash kicked up clouds of dust from the desert floor. When Garrison responded, his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. "Captain Rodriguez, you are an exceptional pilot and a dedicated officer. Your service record is exemplary, and your actions this morning demonstrate exactly the kind of courage and tactical brilliance that makes the United States Air Force the finest military aviation force in the world." Maya waited for the but that would inevitably follow. "But," Garrison continued, "you are also interfering with an operation that is vital to national security. The individuals in that convoy are not hostiles. They are assets working under deep cover to infiltrate and neutralize a terrorist cell that has been planning attacks on American soil. Your attack has compromised years of intelligence work and potentially cost American lives." The words hit Maya harder than the anti-aircraft fire. Assets, not hostiles. Years of intelligence work. American lives at stake. Everything she thought she understood about the situation had just been turned upside down. For a moment, she hesitated. Her finger hovered over the weapon release button as doubt crept into her mind. What if Garrison was telling the truth? What if she'd just attacked American intelligence operatives? What if her decision to engage had actually made the country less safe rather than more secure? Then she remembered the radio intercepts she'd heard earlier. No witnesses, no survivors, no evidence. Those weren't the words of intelligence operatives trying to protect Americans. Those were the words of killers preparing to commit mass murder. "Sir," Maya said, "I intercepted communications from the convoy indicating plans to eliminate all civilians in Esperanza and make it look like cartel violence. That's not an infiltration operation, that's a massacre." Another pause. When Garrison spoke again, his voice had lost its admiring tone. "Captain Rodriguez, you have been fed this information as part of your psychological evaluation. Your actions this morning have confirmed what certain parties suspected about your mental stability and judgment under pressure. The communications you believe you intercepted were fabricated transmissions designed to test your response to perceived threats to your hometown. Psychological evaluation, mental stability, fabricated transmissions." Maya felt the world tilting around her as Garrison's words sank in. They were claiming that everything she'd heard had been fake, part of some elaborate test designed to evaluate her fitness for duty. But even as doubt flooded her mind, Maya's training kicked in. She'd been taught to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from analysis, to evaluate information based on evidence rather than authority. And the evidence didn't support Garrison's story. The convoy's defensive positions were too sophisticated for a simple test. The anti-aircraft weapons now tracking her every movement were real military hardware, not training equipment. The explosion that had destroyed the lead vehicle had been genuine. She could see the smoke rising from the wreckage, smell the burning fuel and melted metal, even through her aircraft's environmental systems. Most importantly, her grandmother was still in Esperanza, along with 846 other people who had no idea that their lives hung in the balance of a conversation taking place at 3,000 feet above the desert. "Sir," Maya said, "with all due respect, I don't believe you." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Even the anti-aircraft fire seemed to pause, as if the entire desert were holding its breath. When Garrison finally responded, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Captain Rodriguez, you have just committed treason against the United States of America. By continuing to engage American assets while under direct orders to cease hostilities, you have violated your oath of office and betrayed the country you swore to defend. Effective immediately, you are designated as a hostile combatant operating in violation of the rules of engagement." Maya's blood turned to ice. Hostile combatant. In military parlance, that meant she was no longer considered an American service member acting in defense of her country. She was an enemy target, authorized for engagement by any available means. As if summoned by Garrison's words, Maya's radar warning system erupted in a cacophony of alerts. 2 new contacts had appeared on her screen, approaching from the north at high speed. F-22 Raptors, the most advanced air superiority fighters in the world, flown by pilots who'd received the same training she had, but who'd been given very different orders. "Phoenix, this is Demon Flight," a voice crackled over the emergency frequency. Maya recognized the call sign, Major Sarah Chun, one of the most skilled pilots at Nellis and someone Maya had considered a friend. "You are ordered to disengage immediately and proceed to Grid Square Charlie 7 for emergency landing and surrender. Any further hostile actions will result in your immediate destruction." Maya stared at her radar screen, watching the 2 F-22s close the distance at supersonic speed. Her F-16 was outmatched in every category that mattered: speed, stealth, weapon systems, and situational awareness. In a straight fight, she wouldn't last 30 seconds against a single Raptor, let alone 2 of them flown by pilots of Chun's caliber. But this wasn't a straight fight. This was a race against time. With 847 lives hanging in balance, Maya looked down at the convoy, which had resumed its movement toward Esperanza during the radio conversation. The remaining 11 vehicles were now only 12 minutes from the town square, where her grandmother would be setting up her small vegetable stand, preparing for another day of selling tomatoes and peppers to neighbors who'd known her for 60 years. 12 minutes to prevent a massacre, or 12 minutes to live with the knowledge that she'd chosen her career over the lives of everyone she'd ever loved. "Sarah," Maya said into her radio, using Chun's first name instead of her call sign. "You know me. You know I wouldn't do this without a reason. There are civilians in danger." "Phoenix," Chun interrupted, her voice tight with stress. "I have my orders. Disengage now, or I will fire on you." Maya closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of all the conversations she'd had with Sarah Chun over the past 3 years. Late-night discussions in the officers' club about tactics and strategy. Friendly competitions during training exercises that had pushed both of them to fly better than they'd thought possible. Quiet moments of mutual support during the grinding. Challenges of military life that only another female pilot could truly understand. All of that history, all of that friendship reduced to a simple equation: follow orders or die. "Sarah," Maya said softly, "I'm sorry." She dove toward the convoy, using the desert terrain to break radar lock and buy herself precious seconds. Behind her, she could hear Chun cursing over the radio as her F-22's sophisticated targeting systems struggled to maintain contact with a target, flying barely 50 feet above the ground at nearly the speed of sound. Maya's second Maverick missile found its target, a vehicle that had been directing the anti-aircraft fire. The explosion sent a column of black smoke into the morning sky and temporarily silenced the weapons that had been tracking her every movement. But 10 vehicles remained, and they were now only 9 minutes from Esperanza. Her fuel gauge showed 14 minutes of flying time remaining. Enough to engage the convoy until her tanks ran dry, but not enough to return to base afterward. Maya was committed now, in every sense of the word. The F-22s were closing fast, their superior speed negating Maya's terrain advantages. She had perhaps 2 more minutes before they'd be in weapons range, and once they fired their AIM-120 missiles, her F-16 would become nothing more than expensive. Scrap metal scattered across the desert floor. 2 minutes to save her hometown, or 2 minutes to live. Maya armed her 20mm cannon and dove toward the convoy, her aircraft screaming through the desert air like an avenging angel painted in Air Force blue and gray. The first AIM-120 and Ram missile launched by Sarah Chun's F-22 Raptor missed Maya's F-16 by less than 10 feet, close enough that the proximity fuse should have detonated and filled the air with deadly shrapnel. Instead, the missile continued past its target and buried itself in a sand dune 2 miles away, its warhead remaining stubbornly intact. Maya didn't have time to wonder why she was still alive. The remaining convoy vehicles had reached the outskirts of Esperanza, and she could see people beginning to emerge from their homes, early risers heading to work, shop owners opening their businesses, children waiting for the school bus that would take them to the regional high school 20 miles away. Her grandmother's house sat at the edge of the town square, its familiar adobe walls painted white and trimmed in turquoise. Maya could see Abuela Carmen in the backyard, hanging laundry on the line between the mesquite trees, unaware that armed men were approaching with orders to kill everyone in town. Maya's 20mm cannon spat fire as she strafed the lead vehicle, her armor-piercing rounds punching through steel and engine blocks with devastating effect. The vehicle slewed sideways and rolled, spilling armed figures onto the dusty ground. But the other vehicles kept moving, spreading out as they entered the town proper. All units, target has entered the containment zone," a voice crackled over the convoy's radio frequency. "Execute Phase 2 immediately. No delays, no exceptions." Phase 2. Maya felt her blood freeze as she realized what that meant. The convoy hadn't just been planning to attack Esperanza, they'd been planning to attack it while she was overhead, ensuring that any investigation would conclude that Captain Maya Rodriguez had gone rogue and massacred her own hometown before. Being shot down by loyal American pilots, the perfect frame-up, with 847 bodies as evidence of her alleged war crimes. Maya's radio exploded with new voices as her understanding of the situation crystallized. Not just Chun and her wingmen anymore, but multiple aircraft converging on her position from different directions. She counted at least 6 additional contacts on her radar screen, F-16s, F-15s, even what looked like an A-10 Thunderbolt configured for close air support. They weren't just trying to stop her. They were putting together the kind of overwhelming force typically reserved for taking down entire enemy squadrons. All aircraft, this is General Patricia Morrison, USAF. A new voice cut through the radio chatter. Maya's hands tightened on her controls as she recognized the name. Morrison was the 4-star general in charge of Air Combat Command, one of the most senior officers in the entire Air Force. Captain Maya Rodriguez has been declared a hostile combatant and is authorized for immediate destruction under rules of engagement Alpha 7. All pilots are cleared to engage with prejudice. Repeat, you are cleared hot on all targets designated Phoenix. Maya's heart hammered against her ribcage as she processed Morrison's words. Rules of engagement Alpha 7 were typically reserved for confirmed enemy combatants operating in active war zones. By invoking those rules, Morrison had essentially declared that Maya was no longer an American service member but an enemy fighter pilot operating in American airspace, which meant that every pilot now converging on her position was authorized ordered, even to kill her without warning or opportunity for surrender. Maya dove toward the town square, her cannon continuing to spit fire at the vehicles that were now disgorging armed figures throughout Esperanza. She could see muzzle flashes from automatic weapons, see civilians beginning to run for cover as they realized what was happening. Her grandmother had disappeared from the backyard, hopefully into the relative safety of her adobe house, but Maya's aircraft was running dangerously low on both fuel and ammunition. Her cannon had maybe 30 seconds of firing time remaining, and her fuel gauge showed 8 minutes until flame out. Even if she managed to stop the massacre, she wouldn't have enough fuel to escape the fighter jets that were now less than 2 minutes from weapons range. She was going to die here, in the desert sky above the town where she'd been born. Branded as a traitor and a mass murderer, the thought should have terrified her. Instead, it brought a strange kind of peace. If this was how her story ended, protecting the people she loved from forces they couldn't even see, then at least it would end with meaning. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maya's cannon fell silent as the last of her ammunition was expended. 3 convoy vehicles remained operational, their occupants now moving through Esperanza's streets with military precision. She could see civilians being herded into the town square at gunpoint, could see the fear on faces that she'd known since childhood. Her radio crackled with Sarah Chen's voice, tight with stress and something that might have been grief. Phoenix, your weapons are dry and your fuel is critical. This is your last chance to surrender. Set down in the square and exit your aircraft with your hands visible. Maya looked down at the town square where her grandmother had taught her to ride a bicycle, where she'd sold lemonade during summer festivals, where she'd given her high school valedictorian speech to a crowd of proud neighbors. Armed figures were setting up what looked like heavy weapons around the perimeter, preparing for a massacre that would be blamed on the pilot they were about to shoot down. "Sarah," Maya said into her radio, "do you have kids?" The question seemed to catch Chun off guard. "What? Maya, what are you? Do you have kids?" Maya repeated. "Nieces, nephews, anyone you'd die for?" "Maya, please, land your aircraft." We can sort this out. I'm looking at 800 people who are about to be murdered, Maya said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. And when it's over, they're going to say I did it. They're going to say Maya Rodriguez went crazy and killed her own neighbors. She could see the F-22s now, silver dots against the blue sky, their contrails writing death sentences in the morning air. Less than 90 seconds to weapons range. They're using us, Sarah, all of us. They needed someone expendable, someone whose background would make this story believable. The Mexican girl from the border town who finally snapped and turned on her. Own people. Maya's fuel gauge showed 6 minutes remaining. Her cannon was empty, her missiles expended. But she still had one weapon left: 3,200 pounds of high-performance fighter. Aircraft traveling at 500 miles per hour. A terrible, perfect weapon for a pilot with nothing left to lose. Phoenix, you are ordered to land immediately, Chun's voice was breaking now, professional composure cracking under the weight of what she was being asked to do. Don't make me shoot you down, please. Maya pulled back on the stick, climbing toward the F-22s that were now visible to the naked eye. Behind her, the surviving convoy vehicles continued their work, herding civilians into the town square where the heavy weapons were nearly in position. Tell me something, Sarah, Maya said conversationally. When did you get your orders to intercept me? This morning after I went off course? Yesterday? Last week? The pause that followed her question was answer enough. They knew, Maya continued. They knew I'd be in the air this morning, knew I'd spot the convoy, knew I'd engage despite orders. This whole thing was planned around me being here. Another pause. When Chun finally responded, her voice was barely a whisper. Maya, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The admission hit Maya like a physical blow. Sarah Chen, her friend, her colleague, someone she'd trusted with her life countless times, had known all along. Had been briefed on the operation, given her orders, told to be ready to shoot down the pilot, who would inevitably try to prevent the massacre. Maya's hands tightened on her controls as she realized the full scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about eliminating a troublesome pilot or covering up some minor intelligence operation. This was about creating a narrative that would justify whatever came next: increased military presence along the border, new restrictions on civil liberties, perhaps even direct military intervention in Mexico. The massacre in Esperanza would be blamed on Maya Rodriguez, the unstable Mexican-American pilot who'd finally revealed her true loyalties. The media would have a field day with the story. The dangerous diversity hire who'd turned on her own country. The affirmative action case study gone wrong. The perfect example of why certain people couldn't be trusted with advanced military technology. 847 lives sacrificed to advance someone's political agenda. Maya's radar warning system screamed as the F-22s achieved missile lock. 30 seconds to impact. She thought of her grandmother, probably huddled in her kitchen as armed figures moved through the streets outside. She thought of Miguel Santos and his grocery store, of the children who should have been safely on their way to school, of all the ordinary people whose only crime had been living in a town that someone had decided needed to disappear. She thought of her father, who'd taught her to fix engines and believe in herself. Her mother, who'd worked double shifts to pay for her daughter's dreams. Her instructors at the academy, the few who'd seen past her accent and her background to recognize genuine talent. She thought of every person who'd ever believed that Maya Rodriguez from Esperanza might actually amount to something. 20 seconds to impact. Maya inverted her F-16 and dove toward the town square, where the heavy weapons were almost ready to begin their grim work. Her aircraft's engines screamed in protest as she pushed them beyond their design limits, trading structural integrity for the speed she needed to reach her target before the AMRAAM missiles reached her. Maya, no! Chun's voice cracked over the radio. Don't do this. 15 seconds to impact. Maya could see individual faces in the town square. Now Mrs. Garcia from the bank, Father Martinez from the church, the teenager who'd helped her change attire during her last visit home. They were looking up at her aircraft, some pointing, most too terrified to do anything but cower as armed figures surrounded them. 10 seconds to impact. The heavy weapons were manned now, their barrels beginning to traverse toward the huddled civilians. In seconds, they would open fire, turning the town square into a killing field that would haunt the desert for generations. 5 seconds to impact. Maya pulled her ejection handles. The rocket-powered seat launched her clear of her F-16, just as the first AMRAAM missile found its target. The explosion turned 16,000 pounds of American military technology into expanding fireball that lit up the desert, morning like a second sunrise. But Maya's aircraft had already completed its final mission, screaming past the heavy weapons at nearly the speed of sound and leaving a wake of superheated air that scattered the armed figures like leaves in a hurricane. Maya's parachute deployed automatically, carrying her toward the desert floor as debris from her F-16 rained down around the convoy vehicles. She could see armed figures running for cover, their carefully planned massacre disrupted by a kamikaze attack they'd never anticipated. She hit the ground hard, her knees buckling as she absorbed the impact of a combat landing in terrain that hadn't been designed for such things. Her flight suit was torn, her helmet cracked, and blood ran down her face from a gash she couldn't remember receiving. But she was alive, and more importantly, the people of Esperanza were alive. The silence that followed her landing was absolute, broken only by the crackling of burning wreckage and the whisper of wind through the mesquite bushes. Maya struggled to her feet, unclipping her parachute harness and drawing her sidearm, a 9mm Beretta that felt pathetically inadequate after the firepower she'd been wielding minutes earlier. Around her, the desert was littered with the remains of both her F-16 and several convoy vehicles that had been caught in the explosion. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage, some moving, others still. The surviving attackers had taken cover among the buildings at the edge of town, but their coordinated assault had been broken. Maya's radio, somehow still functional despite everything that had happened, crackled with voices, Chun and her wingmen calling for search and rescue, ground units requesting status updates, commanders trying to regain control of the situation that had spiraled far beyond their original plans. All units, this is General Morrison. The 4-star's voice cut through the chatter. The Phoenix threat has been neutralized. Begin Phase 3 operations immediately. Phase 3. Maya felt her heart sink as she realized that her sacrifice had been anticipated, planned for, incorporated into whatever larger scheme was unfolding. She disrupted the massacre, but she hadn't stopped the conspiracy that had ordered it. Helicopter rotors echoed across the desert as a flight of Black Hawks approached from the north. Not search and rescue, Maya realized as she saw their dark paint schemes and the heavy weapons mounted on their sides. Cleanup crews, coming to eliminate the evidence and any witnesses who might have survived, including her. Maya began running toward Esperanza, her survival instincts overriding the exhaustion that threatened to drag her to the ground. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the helicopters arrived, 10 minutes to reach her grandmother and warn the survivors about what was coming, 10 minutes to find a way to expose the truth before it was buried forever beneath official lies and classified reports. Behind her, the wreckage of her F-16 burned like a funeral pyre against the desert sky. Maya reached her grandmother's house as the Black Hawk's rotor wash began stirring dust clouds on the horizon. She burst through the familiar wooden door without knocking, her heart hammering as she called out in Spanish. "Abuela, abuela, where are you?" Carmen Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen, her weathered face creased with worry and her gray hair slightly disheveled. At 78, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had weathered 8 decades of desert life, but her dark eyes were sharp and alert. "Mia!" she exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her granddaughter despite Maya's torn flight suit and the blood still trickling from the gash on her forehead. What happened? We heard explosions, saw your airplane. Abuela, listen to me carefully. Maya interrupted, gripping the older woman's shoulders. Bad men came here to hurt people. I stopped them, but more are coming. We need to get everyone to safety, and we need to document what happened before. The rest of her words were drowned out by the thunder of helicopter rotors as the first Black Hawk passed directly overhead, low enough to rattle the windows in. Their frames. Maya peered through the lace curtains and saw armed figures fast roping onto the ground near the town square. How many people were in the square when the shooting started? Maya asked. Maybe 40, 50, Carmen replied. Mrs. Garcia was setting up her produce stand. Father Martinez was opening the church. The children were waiting for the school bus. Are they safe? Carmen nodded. When the shooting started, everyone ran. Father Martinez got most of them into the church basement. Mrs. Garcia and some others are in the bank vault. The children ... double quote. She paused, her face clouding with worry. The children ran toward the old mine shaft. Little Ana Morales was leading them. That girl has more sense than most adults. Maya felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The old copper mine had been abandoned for decades, but she remembered playing in its upper tunnels as a child. If the kids had made it there, they'd be relatively safe from whatever was about to happen in town. Abuela, I need you to do something for Mia, Maya said urgently. Do you still have Abuelo's old ham radio in the basement? Carmen's eyes widened with understanding. Her late husband had been an amateur radio operator, spending hours in his basement workshop talking to other enthusiasts around the world. Equipment was old but functional, and more importantly, it operated on frequencies that weren't monitored by military intelligence. See, but Mia, I don't know I'll operate it. But first, I need you to gather everyone who's hiding and bring them to the church. Can you do that? Carmen straightened her shoulders, and for a moment, Maya could see the steel that had carried her through 60 years of desert hardship. Of course, but what about you? Maya looked out the window again. The Black Hawks had landed, and she could see teams of soldiers moving through the streets with practiced efficiency. They were going door to door, probably evacuating civilians who would never be seen again. I'm going to tell the world what happened here. Maya made her way to the basement as Carmen slipped out the back door, moving with the quiet competence of someone who'd raised 5 children in a town where neighbors looked after each other. The ham radio equipment was exactly where Maya remembered it, an ancient but well-maintained setup that her grandfather had used to talk to people in places she could barely pronounce. She powered up the system and began scanning frequencies, looking for something that would reach beyond the desert, beyond the military's ability to intercept and suppress. After several minutes, she found what she was looking for, a repeater station in Mexico City that was broadcasting on an emergency frequency. This is Captain Maya Rodriguez, United States Air Force, she said into the microphone, speaking in rapid Spanish. I am transmitting from Esperanza, New Mexico, where American military forces have just attempted to massacre civilians as part of a false flag operation. I repeat, this is an active cover-up involving senior military commanders. The response came within seconds, a voice speaking accented but clear English. Captain Rodriguez, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. We are recording your transmission. Please provide details. Maya took a deep breath and began recounting everything that had happened: the convoy, the intercepted communications, the orders to return to base, the revelation that the entire operation had been designed to frame her for the massacre. She spoke quickly but clearly, knowing that every second she remained on the air increased the likelihood that the transmission would be detected and jammed. The senior commanders involved include General Patricia Morrison, USAF, and Deputy Director. Thomas Garrison, Defense Intelligence Agency, she continued. They're using Black Hawk helicopters to eliminate witnesses as we speak. This transmission is being made from Esperanza, New Mexico, at approximately 0930 hours local time on. The basement door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dust. Maya spun around to see three figures in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles despite the morning sunlight outside. The lead figure raised his weapon, some kind of advanced rifle Maya didn't recognize, and spoke in a mechanically distorted voice. "Step away from the radio equipment, Captain Rodriguez." Maya looked at the microphone in her hand, then at the soldiers who had obviously been listening to her transmission. She could hear Dr. Vasquez's voice crackling through the speakers, asking for clarification and promising to relay the information to international media outlets. "You're too late," Maya said quietly. "It's already out there." The lead soldier's finger moved toward his trigger. "Step away from the equipment. Final warning." Instead of stepping away, Maya leaned closer to the microphone. "Dr. Vasquez, there. Here, remember everything I told you. The people of Esperanza deserve." The rifle made a sound like tearing silk, and Maya felt something slam into her chest with the force of a sledgehammer. She found herself on the basement floor, her vision blurring as warmth spread across her flight suit. The radio equipment sparked and smoked where additional rounds had destroyed the transmitter, but it was too late to suppress the transmission. Maya had spoken for nearly 6 minutes, long enough to provide names, details, and a clear account of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Dr. Vasquez and her colleagues at the university would relay the information to journalists, human rights organizations, and foreign governments who had no reason to protect American military secrets. The truth would survive, even if Maya didn't. The soldiers were talking among themselves in that same mechanically distorted speech, but Maya couldn't make out the words over the ringing in her ears. She tried to sit up and found that her body wasn't responding properly. The floor beneath her was warm and wet, and she could taste copper in her mouth. Through the broken basement door, she could hear more explosions, more gunfire. The cleanup operation was thorough and professional, eliminating every trace of the morning's events. By evening, there would be nothing left of Esperanza but a smoking ruin, and the official reports would blame it all on the pilot who'd gone rogue and attacked her own hometown. But the truth had already escaped their control. Maya closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother, who had lived through depression and war and decades of hardship without ever losing faith that tomorrow might be better than today. She thought of her father, who had taught her that fixing things required patience and skill and an understanding of how all the parts worked together. She thought of her mother, who had shown her that caring for others was not weakness but the highest form of strength. That she thought of her F-16, screaming across the desert at 54 feet above ground level, threading the needle between earth and sky with the precision that only came from complete trust in one's abilities. 6 inches. The difference between excellence and insubordination, between heroism and court-martial, between life and death had come down to 6 measly inches. Maya Rodriguez had spent her entire career trying to prove that she belonged in the sky. In the end, she had proven something far more important, that some things were worth dying for, and some truths were too important to suppress. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the sound of helicopter rotors lifting off, carrying their grim cargo away from the ruins of Esperanza toward whatever lies were being prepared to explain the day's events. But in Mexico City, Dr. Elena Vasquez was already making phone calls. In Washington, journalists were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. In newsrooms around the world, editors were trying to verify a story too shocking to believe in, too detailed to ignore. The woman they had tried to silence had found her voice at last, and it would echo far longer than any of them had anticipated. 6 months later, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the podium in the United Nations Human Rights Council chamber in Geneva, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal to the world. The recording of Maya Rodriguez's final transmission had been authenticated by 3 independent laboratories, its contents verified through satellite imagery, survivor testimonies, and leaked classified documents that had somehow found their way to journalists on 4 continents. Distinguished delegates, Dr. Vasquez began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. I present to you evidence of what may be the most significant human rights violation committed by a democratic government in the 21st century. The large screen behind her displayed a satellite image of Esperanza, New Mexico, taken the morning of Maya Rodriguez's last flight. The small town was clearly visible, its adobe buildings arranged around the central square where generations of families had gathered for festivals and celebrations. The next image showed the same location 12 hours later. Nothing remained but charred foundations and scattered debris, as if the town had never existed at all. 847 American citizens were murdered by their own government to cover up an illegal intelligence operation. Dr. Vasquez continued, the only reason we know this happened is because one pilot, Captain Maya Rodriguez, chose to die rather than allow the truth to be buried with her neighbors. In the gallery, Carmen Rodriguez sat with quiet dignity, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she listened to her granddaughter's story being told to the world. She had survived the massacre by pure chance. She'd been in the church basement when the Black Hawks had arrived, hidden among the religious artifacts and old furniture that the cleanup crews had deemed unworthy of their attention. She was one of only 17 survivors. The international investigation had taken months to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. General Patricia Morrison had been quietly transferred to a Pentagon desk job before disappearing entirely, according to unconfirmed reports. She had been relocated under a new identity as part of a witness protection program that protected the witnesses from testifying rather than from retaliation. Deputy Director Thomas Garrison had died in a car accident 3 weeks after the Esperanza incident, his vehicle reportedly experiencing a mechanical failure while traveling on a remote Virginia highway. No mechanical failure had ever been conclusively identified. Colonel Marcus Blackwood had been found dead in his quarters at Nellis Air Force Base, an apparent suicide according to the official report. The fact that he'd left behind a 13-page confession detailing his role in the conspiracy was initially dismissed as the ravings of a mentally unstable officer, but subsequent investigation had confirmed most of his claims. Major Sarah Chun had requested transfer to transport aircraft after the incident, reportedly unable to continue flying fighters after what she'd been ordered to do. She had cooperated fully with investigators, her testimony providing crucial details about the operational planning that had preceded Maya's last flight. The official story, Dr. Vasquez continued, claimed that Captain Rodriguez had suffered a psychotic break and attacked both military assets and civilian targets before being shot down in the defense of innocent lives. This narrative was maintained for 4 months, until evidence began emerging that contradicted every aspect of the government's account. The evidence had come from unexpected sources. Mexican seismic monitoring stations had recorded the explosions in Esperanza, providing timestamps that contradicted the official chronology of events. Amateur radio operators in 3 countries had recorded fragments of Maya's transmission, enough to verify Dr. Vasquez's account of the pilot's final words. Most damaging of all, a former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named David Park had leaked thousands of classified documents showing that Operation Phoenix, as the Esperanza massacre had been codenamed, was part of a larger program designed to justify increased military presence along the Mexican border. The leaked documents revealed that Maya Rodriguez had been selected as the operation's scapegoat months before the attack. Her psychological profile studied, and her likely responses predicted with chilling accuracy. Her Mexican heritage and history of unsafe flying had made her the perfect candidate for a narrative about an unstable minority pilot who had betrayed her country. Captain Rodriguez was not a traitor, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice rising with controlled emotion. She was a patriot who understood that true loyalty means protecting innocent lives, even when those lives belong to people your government has deemed expendable. In the months following the massacre, Maya Rodriguez had become something she'd never been in life: a symbol. Her photograph appeared on protest signs from Mexico City to Berlin. Her story told in documentaries and investigative reports that the American government could neither suppress nor credibly deny. The president had eventually been forced to acknowledge that regrettable incidents had occurred during classified operations along the border, though he stopped short of admitting government responsibility for the Esperanza massacre. 3 congressional committees had been formed to investigate the incident, though their proceedings remained classified and their findings had never been made public. The 17 survivors of Esperanza have been relocated and provided with new identities, Dr. Vasquez continued. They live in constant fear of retaliation, unable to return to their homes or speak publicly about what they witnessed. The American government claims this is for their protection, but the survivors themselves describe it as a form of imprisonment. Carmen Rodriguez shifted in her seat, her face impassive despite the emotional weight of the testimony. She had been offered relocation like the other survivors, but had refused. At 78 years old, she'd told the federal agents who'd approached her she was too old to start over and too stubborn to hide from the truth. Instead, she'd found her weighted journalists, human rights lawyers, and international investigators who were willing to listen to her story. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the timeline of events and identifying the victims who had died in the massacre. Mrs. Rodriguez was the last person to speak with Captain Rodriguez before the pilot's final mission, Dr. Vasquez explained. Her granddaughter's last words to her were these: "Abuela, some things are more important than following orders. Some truths are too big to keep secret." The chamber was absolutely silent as delegates absorbed the weight of that statement. Here was a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about duty, loyalty, and the relationship between citizens and their government. Maya Rodriguez had been faced with an impossible choice: follow orders and allow a massacre, or disobey orders and prevent one. She had chosen to save lives and had been branded a traitor for it. 2 years later, the Maya Rodriguez Memorial Foundation had grown from a small organization run by human rights lawyers into an international movement dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and exposing government corruption. Carmen Rodriguez served on the board of directors, her quiet dignity and moral authority lending credibility to an organization that governments around the world had tried unsuccessfully to discredit. The foundation's headquarters occupied a modern building in Geneva, its walls lined with photographs of government employees who had sacrificed their careers, their freedom, or their lives to expose official wrongdoing. Maya's photograph held the place of honor in the main lobby, not the formal military portrait that showed her in dress uniform, but a candid shot taken during her last visit to Esperanza, showing her laughing with neighborhood children as she taught them how to change attire. Carmen Rodriguez visited the memorial every month, traveling from her new home in Mexico City, where she'd relocated after it became clear that she would never be safe living in the United States. She would sit quietly in front of her granddaughter's photograph, sometimes speaking softly in Spanish, sometimes simply maintaining a peaceful silence that seemed to bring comfort to other visitors who had lost loved ones to government persecution. Foundation had helped expose corruption in dozens of countries, protected hundreds of whistleblowers, and saved thousands of lives by bringing attention to planned atrocities before they could be carried out. Maya Rodriguez's sacrifice had created something larger than herself, a network of people committed to ensuring that powerful institutions could not commit crimes against the powerless without consequence, but the Foundation's greatest success had been much simpler and more personal. Ana Morales had been 12 years old when Maya Rodriguez's F-16 had screamed over Esperanza at 54 feet above ground level. She'd been one of the children waiting for the school bus when the shooting started, one of the kids who had run for the safety of the old mine shaft when armed figures had invaded their town. Now 24 and a recent graduate of the Air Force Academy, Second Lieutenant Ana Morales stood at attention in the same dress blue uniform that Maya Rodriguez had worn at her own commissioning ceremony 15 years earlier. The ceremony was taking place at the Rodriguez Memorial Foundation, not on a military base. Ana had requested that her oath of office be administered by Carmen Rodriguez rather than by a military official. "Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic?" Carmen asked, her voice steady despite the profound emotion of the moment. "I do," Ana replied clearly. "And do you further swear that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same?" "I do." Carmen paused, looking at the young woman who had survived the Esperanza massacre and chosen to dedicate her life to military service despite everything she'd witnessed. Ana Morales could have chosen any profession, could have lived quietly and safely away from the institutions that had failed her hometown so catastrophically. Instead, she'd chosen to become a pilot. "And do you swear," Carmen continued, adding words that weren't part of the official oath but felt necessary nonetheless, "that you will never forget that your highest duty is to protect innocent life, regardless of the orders you receive or the consequences you face?" Ana Morales straightened her shoulders, her dark eyes reflecting the same determination that had once burned in Maya Rodriguez's gaze. "I do." 5 years later, the documentary Phoenix Rising, the Maya Rodriguez story, premiered simultaneously in theaters across 43 countries. Its release coordinated to prevent any single government from suppressing its distribution. Directed by Academy Award winner Sophia Chun, no relation to Sarah Chun. Despite the shared surname, the film combined recreations of Maya's final flight with interviews from survivors, leaked government documents, and previously classified footage that had been obtained through a combination of Freedom of Information Act requests and strategic leaks from government insiders. The most powerful moment in the film came near the end, when Carmen Rodriguez was shown visiting the site where Esperanza had once stood. The town had never been rebuilt. The federal government had declared the area a contaminated zone and prohibited resettlement, though no contamination had ever been detected by independent testing. "She used to tell me that flying was like praying," Carmen said to the camera, her voice carrying across the empty desert where her granddaughter had been born and raised. "You had to trust in something bigger than yourself, something you couldn't see but knew was there." Maya always said the sky didn't care where you came from or what language you spoke at home. It only cared whether you had the courage to belong there. The camera pulled back to reveal the memorial that had been erected at the site, not by the government, which continued to deny responsibility for the massacre, but by private citizens from around the world who had contributed to its construction. The monument was simple, a black granite wall inscribed with the names of all 847 victims, and a bronze statue of an F-16 pulling into a victory roll, its wings catching the desert sunlight. "They tried to erase this place," Carmen continued. "They tried to erase these people, to make it seem like they never existed. But you can't erase the truth. You can hide it, you can lie about it, you can kill people to keep it secret. But the truth has its own life, its own power." Maya understood that. The film's final shot showed Ana Morales, now a major and one of the Air Force's most decorated young pilots, flying her own F-16 over the Esperanza Memorial site. She executed the same victory roll that Maya Rodriguez had performed during her final training exercise, the maneuver that had been deemed unsafe and had triggered the chain of events that led to the massacre. But this time, The victory roll was performed at exactly 60 feet above ground level. 6 feet higher than regulations required. 6 feet higher than Maya had flown that day. A small act of defiance, barely detectable to ground observers, but unmistakable to anyone who understood its significance. 6 inches had once separated compliance from insubordination. 6 feet now separated memory from forgetting. 10 years later, the congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent chambers and millions more following the proceedings. Online. The House Committee on Government, Oversight and Reform had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, the first public hearing on the Esperanza massacre since classified documents had finally been declassified, under pressure from international human rights organizations. General Patricia Morrison, now retired and living under an assumed name, had been subpoenaed to testify. She sat at the witness table looking older than her 68 years, her gray hair pulled back severely and her face showing the effects of a decade spent looking over her shoulder. Committee Chairman Robert Martinez himself, a Mexican-American congressman from New Mexico, had opened the hearing with a statement that left no doubt about the gravity of the proceedings. 10 years ago, 847 American citizens were murdered by their own government, he'd said. For a decade, we have been told that these deaths were the result of a rogue pilot's mental breakdown. Today, we will finally hear the truth about Operation Phoenix and the conspiracy that led to the Esperanza massacre. The questioning had been methodical and relentless. Morrison had initially attempted to maintain her innocence, claiming that she'd been following orders from superiors whose names remained classified. But as classified documents were entered into evidence and survivors testified via video link from their secure locations, her story had begun to crumble. General Morrison, Congressman Martinez said, holding up a document stamped with classification so high that it had taken a presidential order to declassify it. This is a memorandum, dated 6 months before the Esperanza incident, written by you and addressed to the Secretary of Defense. In it, you recommend that domestic military operations should be conducted with maximum public impact to justify enhanced border security measures. Did you write this memorandum? Morrison stared at the document, her face pale. I don't recall. The specific, General Morrison, Martinez interrupted. This document bears your electronic signature and was found on servers that you personally controlled. Did you write it? A long pause. Yes. And did you subsequently develop Operation Phoenix as a means of creating the maximum public impact you recommended? Another pause, longer this time. The operation was developed in response to legitimate intelligence threats. General Morrison, yes or no? Did you develop Operation Phoenix to create a false flag incident that would justify increased military presence along the Mexican border? Morrison looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support from former colleagues or government officials. She found none. Everyone who had been involved in the conspiracy was either dead, in hiding, or had already provided testimony in exchange for immunity. Yes, she whispered. The admission sent shockwaves through the hearing room and around the world. For the first time, a senior military official had acknowledged under oath that the Esperanza massacre had been a deliberately planned false flag operation designed to manipulate public opinion. And Captain Maya Rodriguez, Martinez continued. Was she selected as a scapegoat because of her ethnic background and previous disciplinary issues? Morrison's voice was barely audible. Yes. Did you give orders for her aircraft to be shot down even though she was attempting to prevent a massacre of American civilians? Yes. And did you subsequently order the elimination of survivors and witnesses to cover up your crimes? Morrison looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting her testimony around the world. Yes, the hearing room erupted in chaos as spectators reacted to Morrison's confessions. But in the gallery, Carmen Rodriguez sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap and her expression peaceful. At 88, she had lived long enough to see the truth finally acknowledged by those who had tried to bury it. Justice would never bring back the 847 people who had died in Esperanza, would never restore the town that had been erased from the map. But truth was its own form of justice, and Maya Rodriguez's final transmission had proven more powerful than any weapon in the government's arsenal. 15 years later, Colonel Ana Morales stood in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, her hands steady on controls that would have been incomprehensible to the pilots of Maya Rodriguez's generation. The F-35 Lightning II was a marvel of 21st century technology, capable of speeds and maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. But as Ana performed her pre-flight checks, she was thinking about an older aircraft and an older pilot who had flown her final mission with nothing more sophisticated than analog gauges and mechanical controls. Ana commanded the 427th Fighter Squadron now, a unit that had been unofficially renamed the Phoenix Squadron in honor of Maya Rodriguez. The squadron's patch showed an F-16 rising from flames, with the Spanish words, La Verdad Vuela, embroidered beneath, The Truth Flies. Today's mission was different from the routine training exercises and border patrol flights that typically occupied Ana's squadron. Today, they were escorting a special transport aircraft carrying a very special passenger on a very important journey. Carmen Rodriguez was 93 years old and dying. Cancer, the doctors had told her family, though Carmen herself seemed less concerned about her diagnosis than about completing one final journey. She had demanded really, in the polite but implacable way that only very elderly women could manage, to return to the place where Esperanza had once stood. The federal government had initially refused the request. The site remained officially classified, contaminated, and off-limits to civilian access. But Carmen Rodriguez had spent 15 years becoming one of the most recognizable faces in the international human rights movement, and her dying wish had attracted support from unexpected quarters. The Mexican government had formally requested that their honorary citizen Carmen Rodriguez be permitted to visit the memorial site on what would likely be her final journey. The European Union had issued a statement supporting her request. The Pope had personally blessed her mission during a private audience at the Vatican. Most importantly, Colonel Ana Morales had requested permission to provide military escort for the transport aircraft carrying her childhood hero's grandmother home. The Pentagon had eventually capitulated, though they'd insisted on elaborate security measures and strict limits on media access. Carmen Rodriguez could visit the site, but only under military escort and only for a carefully limited time. As Ana led her F-35s through the desert sky above New Mexico, she could see the transport aircraft below a specially modified C-130 that had been outfitted with medical equipment and comfortable seating for an elderly passenger who might not survive the journey home. But Carmen Rodriguez was tougher than anyone had expected. Through the squadron's radio frequency, Ana could hear the transport pilot reporting that his passenger was alert and looking out the windows, pointing out landmarks and sharing memories of the landscape that had shaped her granddaughter's dreams. Phoenix Squadron, this is Shepherd 1. The transport pilot's voice crackled over the radio. My passenger requests permission to speak with the escort commander. Ana switched to the frequency that had been established for communication with the transport. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Colonel Morales. How are you feeling? Carmen's voice came through the speakers with surprising strength despite her age and illness. I'm feeling grateful, Mia. Grateful to see this sky again. Grateful that Maya's story lived long enough for the world to hear it. Ana felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd met Carmen Rodriguez dozens of times over the years, had considered her an honorary grandmother, and a source of wisdom and strength. But hearing her voice in the cockpit of an F-35, high above the desert where everything had begun, felt like completing a circle that had been drawn in fire and blood 15 years ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, Ana said, your granddaughter saved my life. She saved all of us. I want you to know that every day I fly, I carry her memory with me." A pause filled only with the whisper of radio static and the distant rumble of jet engines. "She would be so proud of you, Mia," Carmen said finally. "All of you. She always said that the sky belonged to everyone who had the courage to claim it. You've proven her right." The memorial site appeared on the horizon, its black granite wall and bronze aircraft statue stark against the desert landscape. Aina had visited the site countless times over the years, but seeing it from the air from Maya Rodriguez's perspective added a dimension of meaning that ground visits could never provide. The transport aircraft touched down on the temporary landing strip that had been constructed for this visit, its wheels raising small clouds of dust that were immediately dispersed by the desert wind. Aina and her squadron performed the ceremonial flyover, their F-35s arranged in missing man formation, 4 aircraft flying in close formation with a gap where the 5th should have been dot. As they passed over the memorial, Aina pulled her aircraft into a victory roll at exactly 60 feet above ground level. Behind her, the other members of Phoenix Squadron followed suit, their advanced fighters performing the same maneuver that had once been deemed unsafe and insubordinate. On the ground, Carmen Rodriguez was helped from the transport aircraft by medical personnel and Air Force officers who treated her with the reverence due to a head of state. She moved slowly but steadily toward the memorial wall, her weathered hands tracing the names of the 847 people who had died in the Esperanza massacre. Aina landed her F-35 on the temporary strip and quickly made her way to the memorial, arriving just as Carmen reached the center of the wall where Maya Rodriguez's name was inscribed in letters slightly larger than the others. "She's here," Carmen whispered, her fingers touching the bronze letters that spelled out her granddaughter's name. "I can feel her presence in this place." Aina stood quietly beside the elderly woman, both of them looking up at the bronze F-16 that seemed to be climbing toward the infinite blue of the desert sky. The sculpture was anatomically perfect, every rivet and antenna rendered with obsessive attention to detail. But it was the pilot's helmet visible in the cockpit that brought tears too. Aina's eyes, it bore the call sign Phoenix in stylized letters, exactly as Maya Rodriguez had worn it on her final flight. "She used to tell me about flying," Carmen said, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "She said that up there, above the clouds, you could see things clearly. The earth looked different from that height, no borders, no walls, just one world spinning in space with everyone on it together." Carmen reached into a small bag she'd carried from the aircraft and withdrew something. Aina hadn't expected a handful of soil from the garden behind the house where Maya Rodriguez had grown up. The house had been destroyed in the massacre, but Carmen had saved earth from the vegetable garden where she'd taught her granddaughter to grow tomatoes and peppers. She scattered the soil at the base of the memorial wall, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. "Now she's home," Carmen said simply. The ceremony was brief. Carmen was too frail for extended exposure to the desert heat, and the security restrictions limited how long they could remain at the site. But as the elderly woman was helped back toward the transport aircraft, she paused and looked back at the memorial one final time. "Colonel Morales," she called out, "come here, please." Aina approached, uncertain what Carmen might want to say in these final moments. "I want you to have something," Carmen said, reaching into her bag again. She withdrew a small object wrapped in faded tissue paper, something that had clearly been treasured and carefully preserved for many years. Aina unwrapped the tissue paper and found herself looking at a pair of silver wings, the kind worn by Air Force pilots on their dress uniforms. But these were different from the standard wings she wore on her own uniform. These were older, slightly tarnished, and engraved with a name on the back, Rodriguez. "She earned these the day she graduated from flight school," Carmen explained. "She was so proud, so happy. She called me from the base and said, 'Abuela, I did it. I'm really going to fly.' I want you to carry them with you." Ana felt tears running down her cheeks as she held the wings that Maya Rodriguez had worn during her brief but extraordinary career. They were more than just a piece of jewelry. They were a tangible connection to the pilot whose sacrifice had changed the world. "I'll carry them always," Ana promised. Carmen smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features and revealing the beauty she must have possessed as a young woman. She always said the truth would fly higher than any lie. She was right, wasn't she? 20 years later, the United States Air Force Academy's class of 2045 graduated under circumstances that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of military aviators. The ceremony was conducted virtually, with families around the world watching as their sons and daughters raised their right hands and swore to support and defend the Constitution. Among the graduates was Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, whose great-grandmother had once run a small grocery store in a town called Esperanza. Maria had grown up hearing stories about the massacre, about the pilot who had sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives, and about the grandmother who had spent decades ensuring that the truth would never be forgotten. Now, wearing the same silver wings that her ancestor had earned 25 years earlier, Maria prepared to begin her own career as an Air Force pilot. The wings had been passed down through the Rodriguez family, carried by each successive generation of pilots who had chosen to honor Maya Rodriguez's memory through their service. But the wings had acquired additional significance over the years. They had become a symbol of something larger than military service, something that transcended national boundaries and institutional loyalties. They had become a symbol of the duty to protect innocent life, regardless of orders or consequences. In military academies around the world, cadets learned about the Phoenix Doctrine, the principle that a soldier's highest obligation was to prevent atrocities, even when those atrocities were ordered by legitimate authority. The doctrine had been incorporated into international military law following the Esperanza revelations, and it had prevented dozens of massacres in the decades since Maya Rodriguez's death. The Phoenix Squadron still flew combat missions, now commanded by General Ana Morales and equipped with aircraft that pushed the boundaries of atmospheric flight. But their most important mission wasn't combat, it was education. Every new pilot in the United States Air Force spent time with Phoenix Squadron, learning about the pilot whose call sign they honored and the principle she had died defending. In the annals of military history, few stories resonate as powerfully as that of Captain Maya Rodriguez, a fighter pilot whose single act of conscience changed the course of military ethics forever. This extraordinary tale spans decades, weaving together themes of moral courage, institutional accountability, and the enduring power of individual choice in the face of overwhelming authority. 30 years ago, Captain Maya Rodriguez climbed into her F-16 Fighting Falcon for what would become the most consequential flight in modern military history. A decorated pilot with an exemplary service record, Maya had been selected for Operation Phoenix, ostensibly a routine border security mission. What she discovered that morning would force her to choose between following orders and protecting innocent lives, a choice that would cost her everything. As Maya flew her assigned route over the Nevada desert, she witnessed something that shattered her understanding of duty and honor. A military convoy was moving toward the small town of Esperanza, New Mexico, home to 847 civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and children going about their daily lives. Through her radio communications, Maya learned the horrifying truth. This wasn't a protective mission. It was a massacre disguised as military necessity. Operation Phoenix was revealed to be a false flag operation, designed to eliminate an entire community and blame their deaths on a rogue pilot, Maya herself. The plan was chillingly precise. Maya would be ordered to attack the town, then be shot down by her fellow pilots, creating a narrative of a mentally unstable officer who had turned against her own people. The massacre would generate public support for increased military intervention along the Mexican border, but Maya Rodriguez refused to become complicit in genocide. In her final transmission, recorded by Dr. Elena Vasquez at a nearby research station, Maya's voice cut through military protocol with stunning clarity. This is Captain Maya Rodriguez, tail number 910403. I have visual on Operation Phoenix Convoy moving towards civilian target Esperanza. 847 American citizens are about to be murdered by their own government. I am engaging the convoy to prevent this massacre. Tell them Maya Rodriguez died protecting innocent lives, not destroying them. At 54 feet above ground level, Maya made her choice. She turned her F-16 against the military convoy, disrupting the planned massacre and saving hundreds of lives. Her actions prevented the complete destruction of Esperanza, though she paid the ultimate price when fellow pilots, following their orders, shot her down over the desert she had protected. For 4 years, the official narrative painted Maya Rodriguez as a traitor who had suffered a psychotic break. Her military honors were revoked, her name erased from service records, and her memory tainted by accusations of treason. But the truth, as Maya had predicted, would eventually soar higher than any lie. Maya's story gains profound depth through her relationship with her grandmother, Carmen Rodriguez, who had raised her after her parents' death. Carmen embodied the resilience and moral clarity of generations of women who had survived displacement, poverty, and discrimination while maintaining their dignity and principles. She had taught Maya that some things were more important than safety, more important than following principles that would guide her granddaughter's final moments. In a letter hidden beneath loose floorboards in her childhood bedroom, Maya had written to her grandmother before her final flight, "You didn't raise me to be a good soldier, Abuela. You raised me to be a good person. And good people don't let innocent families get murdered, even when someone in uniform tells them it's necessary." Carmen Rodriguez would spend the remaining years of her life ensuring that the truth about her granddaughter's heroism would eventually emerge. She collected evidence, protected survivors, and never wavered in her conviction that Maya had died as a hero, not a traitor. The story's power extends far beyond Maya's individual sacrifice. Over the following decades, her example transformed military culture in ways both subtle and profound. Phoenix Squadron, named in her honor, became a symbol of ethical military service, with pilots learning about the moment when following orders and doing right diverged so dramatically. General Morales, who had known Maya personally, made her story the centerpiece of pilot training. Flying is about the moment when you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. Maya Rodriguez made that choice at 54 feet above ground level, and she changed the world. The story introduces us to Lieutenant Colonel Ana Morales, Carmen Rodriguez's adopted daughter, who spent 25 years flying memorial routes over the site where Esperanza once stood. Each flight served as a reminder that individual conscience could triumph over institutional pressure, that one person's courage could inspire generations of ethical military service. Perhaps most powerfully, the narrative shows us Lieutenant James Morrison, grandson of General Patricia Morrison, the architect of the Esperanza massacre. His decision to join the Air Force, and specifically request assignment to Phoenix Squadron, represents the possibility of redemption, of breaking cycles of institutional evil through individual choice to be better than when circumstances require. Story culminates 30 years later in the International Court of Justice, where Maya Rodriguez's final transmission becomes the cornerstone of an unprecedented case. For the first time in history, an international court hears evidence that a democratic government committed war crimes against its own citizens. Maria Santos Chen, herself a survivor of the intended massacre who had devoted her life to military justice reform, argued the case that would finally vindicate Maya's sacrifice. The courtroom heard 6 months of evidence, classified documents, survivor testimony, Technical analysis of the massacre site, all proving that Operation Phoenix had been a carefully planned false flag operation that went exactly according to plan until one pilot chose conscience over orders. The court's ruling was historic. Captain Maya Rodriguez was not a rogue pilot suffering from mental instability. She was a decorated officer who recognized an imminent threat to civilian lives and chose to act in accordance with her oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The story concludes with the dedication of the Maya Rodriguez Memorial at Nellis Air Force Base, a full-scale bronze replica of her F-16, frozen in the moment of her final victory roll, positioned as if climbing toward the infinite desert sky. Surrounding the aircraft are walls inscribed with the names of all 847 intended victims of the Esperanza massacre, along with excerpts from Maya's final transmission translated into dozens of languages. But the memorial's most powerful element is its simplest, a small plaque bearing Maya Rodriguez's own words about the choice between following orders and doing what's right. It serves as a permanent reminder that systems don't make moral decisions, people do. And sometimes those decisions require courage that goes beyond anything taught in military academies. Maya Rodriguez's story transcends military history to become a universal tale about individual moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. It asks fundamental questions about obedience and conscience, about the responsibility of individuals within systems of power, and about the price of standing up for truth when that truth is inconvenient to authority. The story demonstrates that heroism isn't about following orders perfectly. It's about recognizing the moments when following orders perfectly would make you complicit in evil. Maya Rodriguez understood that her oath was ultimately to principles higher than military hierarchy, to protection of innocent life rather than blind obedience to authority. Through multiple generations of characters, the narrative shows how individual courage can create ripple effects that transform entire institutions. Maya's sacrifice didn't just save lives in that desert moment. It changed how military officers thought about their obligations, created new traditions of ethical reflection, and ultimately led to international recognition of the principles she died defending. The story of Maya Rodriguez represents just one example of the countless individuals throughout history who have faced impossible choices between institutional loyalty and moral conscience. These stories matter because they remind us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, that individual choices can change the course of history, and that courage often requires sacrificing everything for principles larger than ourselves. If Maya Rodriguez's story has moved you, if you believe in the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional evil, and if you want to hear more untold stories of moral courage in the face of overwhelming odds, please subscribe to our channel. Each story we share honors those who chose principle over convenience, truth over safety, and justice over obedience. Subscribe today and help us ensure that the voices of those who spoke truth to power, like Maya Rodriguez's final transmission, from 54 feet above the Nevada desert, continue to soar higher than any lie. These stories deserve to be told, these heroes deserve to be remembered, and these lessons about courage and conscience deserve to be passed on to future generations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel.